On Wednesday, we were discussing sectionalism. We began discussing sectionalism, the idea that things were being moved apart or taken apart. And one of the things we discussed briefly was the impact that slavery was having on the United States. And we looked at this particular map that shows the number of slaves, where they came from, where they went into the Western Hemisphere. And surprisingly, most of them go to South America and the Caribbean. The reason we were looking at that is because of the Slave Trade Act of 1807. And what did that do? Did that ban slavery? No. What did it ban? It banned the import of slaves. But the slave trade continued within the United States, and that was because slavery had become self-sustaining. There were enough slaves in the United States that they could sustain themselves in terms of numbers. The birth rate was higher than the death rate. What we see, part of it is a result of the feelings about slavery, but really there's some different feelings about several different things when it comes to the United States and its regions or its sections. And in fact, what begins happening in the early 1800s is we have two distinct regions with very distinct cultural differences. And you still see cultural differences today. You know, people up north of here talk really funny, don't they? They think we talk funny. Okay. If you go to somebody's house and they ask you, would you like a Coke? You're liable to get a Coca-Cola, right? But you might get a Sprite, you might get a Dr. Pepper, you might get a root beer. Because Coke is, for us, is a generic term that means a soft drink. You go up north and you want a pop? Would you like a pop? I don't know, pop? What are you talking about? Give me a Coca-Cola. And it's just a cultural difference. But during the early 1800s, we have some cultural differences that go deeper than just what you call a drink. How you viewed slavery, part of that was cultural. Education, we talked about that earlier. That was part of the culture. It wasn't real important in the South. It was in the North. What happens is we end up with two Americas. We have the industrial North, very manufacturing-oriented, industrial, really took advantage of the Industrial Revolution. And then you have the South, which is agrarian, is agricultural. People are growing things. Now, having said that, let me ask you a question. You don't have to answer it. Yes, you do, but I'm not going to tell you the right answer. Which part of the nation do you think grew most of the food that was eaten? Okay. Most everybody whispered the South or said the South. Let's look. Okay. If you look about the middle of this chart, you see two things. You see the South is growing 99.9% of the cotton compared to 1/10 of 1%. And then look at the food. 72% of the nation's food in 1860 was grown in the northern states. And then you can look at things like population, bank deposits, the number of factories, horses. Why would horses be important? What? Transportation. Although the South does have the smartest of the four-legged animals, and that'd be a donkey or a mule. They really are smarter than horses. Yeah. And then, of course, railroad tracks. So as we enter into 1860, it is very evident that the North has a tremendous advantage over the South in most key economic areas. And that eventually plays out, but not initially. All right. So there are some differences. There are some cultural differences. There are economic differences. And there are even constitutional differences. How is the Constitution interpreted? That causes the United States to drift further apart, the North and the South. And there are a couple of terms that I use interchangeably. For example, the North I might call the free states, and the South would be the slave states. And I think that's probably a better way to look at things, is free and slave. So the cotton gin is invented in 1793, 1794, really goes into production in 1797 or so. And overnight, cotton production skyrockets. It becomes much more profitable to grow cotton. And over that next 50 years, by 1850, the Southern agricultural economy is entirely dependent on cotton. They don't grow anything else. There are very few other cash crops. Tobacco would be one of the others. Now, here's my question. Can you eat tobacco? You can chew it. Wouldn't advise it, but you can chew it. Can you eat cotton? No. So they're not growing food, but they are growing cotton. And in fact, by 1860, that's the number one export in the United States. Cotton. And most of it's going to Europe. When you looked at cotton production around the world, Southern cotton production is twice the rest of the world. And so you have all this cotton. It's prevalent. There's a lot of it. And it's cheap. 13 cents a pound roughly in 1860. And so the Southern United States can outsell the rest of the world. They can outproduce the rest of the world. And they do. Times two. Georgia is producing a little over 15% of the U.S. total cotton production. That's pretty significant. And what you see in Georgia and in other southern states is plantation owners can buy land. They can afford land. So they do. And when they buy that land, they plant more cotton. And when they plant more cotton, they make more money. And when they make more money, what do? They buy more land so they can buy more slaves, so they can plant more cotton. And so it becomes this cyclical thing. Buy more land, buy more slaves, plant more cotton, make more money, buy more slaves. And so rather than reduce slavery, which is what Eli Whitney saw or what he envisioned, the cotton gin causes slavery to increase. And again, Georgia's not growing food. They're growing cotton. And because they're growing cotton, they have to import food. Now, is that really a problem before 1861? Not really. But what about 1861? Georgia says, we don't want to be a part of the United States anymore. We're going to join the Confederacy. Where does their food come from now? Nowhere. They got to grow it. And in fact, plantation owners in Georgia in 1860, 1861, when they were seceding from the United States, they said, we will grow food. Guess what? They lied. They actually grew more cotton. And so Georgia, like a lot of southern states at the time, really struggled to feed the army, but more importantly, to feed the citizens of their state. Now, this is a quote from, I think it's Georgia Odyssey. I think that's where I took this from. But it's kind of a funny little quote about the importance of cotton during the antebellum period. It was actually written by a fellow who visited Georgia during the antebellum period. And these words are his thoughts on that. He wrote, people live in cotton houses. let's just really cotton houses. I mean, made out of cotton? No. Houses that were bought because of cotton. Okay. So people live in cotton houses and ride in cotton carriages. They buy cotton, sell cotton, think cotton, eat cotton, drink cotton, and dream cotton. They marry cotton wives, and unto them are born cotton children. In enumerating the charms of a fair widow, they begin by saying, she makes so many bales of cotton. Cotton was the great staple, sum, and substance of life for Georgia Plant. There was nothing more important. Life revolved around cotton for those people who were fortunate enough to get wealthy from it. And that's a very small percentage of people, by the way. The South's dependence grows on cotton, and as the South's dependence grows on cotton, so does its dependence on slavery. Because during the antebellum period, you could not grow cotton without slavery. And we see that after the Civil War, U.S. cotton production goes. Why? Because they didn't know how to grow cotton without slaves. It is a very labor-intensive crop and difficult to keep the pace that they grew cotton during the antebellum period. So they couldn't. And again, talk about that cycle: more land, more slaves, more cotton, more land, more slaves, more cotton. Just an endless cycle. And I think if history teaches us anything about slavery, it teaches us that you cannot have a slave-based economy and survive. Every slave-based economy that's ever existed has died. And I think if you go back and you look at the history, you'll find that to be true. Think of Egypt. You know about Egypt, right? Moses came out of Egypt. Let my people go. Okay? That's one of the reasons that American slaves were so enamored with the story of Moses, because it meant freedom. It meant the end of slavery. Anytime you have slaves that are the basis of your economy, you're always going to fail. Why? Because enslaved people don't want to be enslaved. And eventually somebody's going to come along and set them free, or they're going to set themselves free. And your economy is going to fail. And we saw that in the American South after the Civil War, during and after the Civil War. And there are other instances of it as well. Slavery becomes the hot button topic. You want to get a good argument going, you just walk in the barbershop and start talking about slavery. And people are going to get upset. They're going to express and voice their opinion. And really, by the early 1800s, it becomes the most controversial issue in the United States. If you go to the 20th century, probably abortion, at least when I became an adult, as I was becoming an adult, was the most controversial issue. I mean, people were polarized by it. Immigration, about as long ago as 10 years ago, it really became a very controversial issue. And people were polarized. Either you wanted, people pouring through the border, or you didn't. And there was very little middle ground. Slavery made abortion and immigration minor in comparison. It's kind of like the difference between COVID and the sniffles. There's a big difference, isn't there? You get the COVID and you might die. You get the sniffles and you're just gonna feel bad. All right? Well, slavery would be COVID, and these other things would be the sniffles. They were that minor in comparison to slavery because everybody had an opinion on slavery. And there were very few people who stood in the middle. And so it split people apart. It split families apart. Not just because one side fought for the North and one side fought for the South. It split families apart because one part of the family, one member of the family couldn't believe that they would endorse slavery. And the other side was like, I can't believe you wouldn't endorse slavery. And it literally tore families apart. This is the census. Well, let me back up. Number of slaves per state. Virginia has more. Georgia doesn't have as many, but it doesn't have as many people living in Georgia as in Virginia. Mississippi, where's Mississippi? Number 3. I want you to look for something. I'm going to show you the full census here in just a second. And I want you to look at Mississippi, and I want you to tell me something. You actually have a copy of it on the next page. Okay? But here's the census. In 1860, there were 27,185,109 free people. There were 3,941,557 enslaved persons. Total population of over 31 million people living in the United States. Okay? Here's Georgia. 462,230 slaves, 595,000, I think that's a 607, whatever. A little over 595,000 free people. Together, it's a little over 1,057,327. So, I mean, you look at this, and that's not far from being half and half, is it? Just look at the numbers. They're pretty close. But look at Mississippi. 351,699 free people, 436,696 slaves. More slaves than free people. More enslaved persons than free people. And if you look at other southern states, you don't find that, but you see the populations are pretty close. Louisiana, for example, 376,000 to 332,000. It's pretty close. Tennessee, it's a huge difference. Texas, a big difference. Virginia. Remember, Virginia has more slaves, but Virginia is the only southern state with over 1 million people in population. So, all of this, and I tell you all of this, I show you this because this becomes an issue. Yes. Sure. Okay. How is representation in the House decided? Population, right? So you start looking at a census, or you look at a population density map or a population map, where do most of the people live in the United States in 1860? Even 1850, they live north, right? Okay? They live north. So where do most of the people who serve in the House of Representatives come from? The north. Higher population, more representatives. How's representation in the Senate determined? Everybody gets 2. So that's equal, isn't it? And remember, if a bill goes to the House and it's voted on, it then has to be approved by the Senate. And if the Senate doesn't approve it, it goes back to the House and it's probably going to die. So there's this balance. And for a long time, there were the same number of free states as there were slave states. So representation in the Senate was what? Equal. Representation in the House, South's never going to win any battles in the House, or the slave states are never going to win any battles in the House because they're going to be outvoted. But because they're equal in the Senate, they can maintain a sense of fairness, or at least that's how they thought. And so that becomes a big issue. And we're going to see some compromises that are enacted because there are more free states than there are slave states. There's more population in those free states than there are in the slave states. In 1860, I think we counted there were 34 states, there were 19 free states, and 15 slave states. And so by that time, there had been a shift, although not really, because, yeah, there had been. Anyway, y'all want to stop here? Okay, let's stop right here.